Hello, everyone, and welcome to NCSL's webinar, Redistricting 101. My name is Wendy Underhill, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm the Director for Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislatures. It is coincidental that we are here today just a couple of hours after the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on two partisanship redistricting cases, something that will definitely capture today's headlines. We were fortunate to have a quick little report from Ben Williams, who was in the Supreme Court, and I'm just going to read you 3 or 4 sentences on that, and then we will jump into our plan for Redistricting 101. Ben is the legal counsel at Princeton's redistricting program, and what he wrote is, the justices seemed more persuaded by the plaintiff's argument in the Maryland case than the North Carolina case. If there's a swing justice, it might be Justice Kavanaugh and not Chief Justice Roberts. The questions focus more on standards to apply nationwide than on the facts of either case. The court does seem divided along ideological lines. Barring some unexpected holding on procedural or other related issues, it looks like we might be headed for another 5-4 votes. Of course, that begs the question which direction, and Ben did not weigh in on which direction he thinks that might go. All right, so for today's webinar, I have a few logistical items I'd like to go over before we turn it over to our fabulous presenters today. The first is that there is a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and it's green, and we encourage you to type questions or comments in there at any time. Your questions will be visible to anybody. To be sure you're comfortable with that chat function and to also see who's on the line today, I invite you to type in your state name or give us your name if you'd like to do that. I'm going to just give it a moment to see Matt, and okay, not too many people. Yeah, here we go. All right. So keep that in mind throughout. We do plan to answer any questions you put in that chat box at the end of the presentation, and if we can't get to them all, we'll send out responses after the fact. In addition to that chat box, there is a spot for a couple of tabs up above the slides themselves. You'll see one tab that says Resources, and of course, if you click on that, then you'll find links to several NCSL resources on redistricting. We've put in there our redistricting starter kit for legislative staff and others, plus links to web pages on commissions, redistricting criteria, and the homepage for our 5 upcoming in-person redistricting seminars. We've also included a link to the redistricting game we'll mention later on. And another tab right next to that is labeled Speaker, and where you can go there, you'll see the bios of today's speakers, and you can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. Also, if you have colleagues and friends who couldn't join us today, you can let them know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. And then just one last thing, if you can't hear me or have any technical problems, try logging back in or send an email to events@ncsl.org. All right, now I'm going to move on to the business part of today. This webinar will discuss the basics of redistricting, and that means that we are not aiming our content at those of you who've been in the field for decades, although we're glad you're here with us. I'm not trying to say that. Instead, the goal is to introduce new people to the wild and exciting world of redistricting. If the experienced people want to share a short anecdote in the chat box, please do. That'll make it more come to life for everyone. Also, please know that some of what we discussed today may be true in many states, but may not be true in your state. Variations are, in fact, the norm in redistricting, so watch out for that. All right, time to introduce our presenters, Michelle Davis and Nick Ferris. You're welcome to read their bios, but I'm not going to read them to you. Instead, I'll just share that each of these 2 experts has at least 2 redistricting cycles under their belts. And Michelle, among other roles, is the managing editor for the next edition of NCSL's Redistricting Law Book. So that means that she and I get to talk weekly, and you can expect that new edition out in the summer. And Nick Ferris and I found ourselves testifying together before a legislative committee in the state of Washington, where he's from, and that's when I knew we needed to put him to work for our members as well. And based on that experience, I can tell you it would be hard to find anyone better able to distill legal and practical knowledge as well as these 2 can. Nick, I'm about to turn it over to you, but first I'll just remind everyone one last time that you can ask questions in that chat box, including if you are having technical difficulty. Nick, it's all yours.
Hello, or good morning where I am. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. So I thought we'd start out with a very, very high-level view of why are we here in the first place? Why are we talking about redistricting? Why do we go through this sometimes very stressful process every 10 years? And the first answer is because the Constitution says the federal Constitution says there shall be a census every 10 years to count all the people in the United States, and the seats in the House of Representatives will be allocated to the states based on their relative populations. Obviously, if you repeat this process, the numbers are going to come out different. The number of seats is currently set at 435. That has changed over the decades, but not since the last time was just after Hawaii and Alaska were admitted. It bumped up temporarily and went back to 435. So we're talking about a fixed number of seats, which will be reallocated every 10 years. So that for a given state, that may change from decade to decade. And currently, under federal law, each representative in Congress must have their own district. In the past, like I know Washington back in the 50s, when they first got their 7th seat, they couldn't decide for a while where to put that district, so they just didn't. They just had the 7th run at large for a few cycles, but under current federal law, that is not permitted. And the Constitution gives the House of Representatives and the Senate the power to determine who is qualified to sit in their respective chambers, so that's their call. And at the moment, there are no at-large seats in states with more than one representative, and no multi-member districts, which is something that happens in other countries too. A couple of Supreme Court cases that affect the redistricting process. Several landmark cases came out in the mid to late 60s, particularly Reynolds versus Sims. And that held that state legislative districts in any chamber, so either the upper or the lower chamber, since all but one state has two, must be equal in population. So a lot of states prior to that had, for instance, structured their state senates where each county got a senator. It was done based on existing political units, and Reynolds versus Sims held that that is not permissible. So for within a given chamber, all of the districts must be the same size. And then Westbury versus Sanders extended that same thinking to congressional districts within a particular state. Obviously, the allocation doesn't come out exactly right to make every congressional district nationwide exactly equal, but within a given state, they have to be equal in size. And it's simply a fact of demographics that population will grow at different rates in different places across the state. So from time to time, you have to go back and redraw those districts to maintain equality. At least under Washington law, it is stipulated that that must be done based on the population figures from the decennial census, but your state may have other permissible data sources to do that. When will this all happen? April 1st, 2020 is the official census day. Now, obviously, it takes a long time to collect and collate all the information necessary to count every individual in the United States, but April 1st, 2020 is the day that it's intended to be valid. So the question is, where are you, will you be living on April 1st, 2020? Prior to that, there are various geography programs that the Census Bureau conducts, starting in 2015, I believe. The second one there, the BBSP, or Block Boundary Suggestion Program, allows states to designate particular lines, particular visible features like streets or political boundaries that the state feels would make good census tabulation block boundaries, and we'll get into what a block is in a second, or to say, no, that street would be problematic as a block boundary largely for the reason that, for instance, it would make a problematic district boundary if it were held as a tabulation block boundary. And the BBSP this time also allowed states to review their local geographies, their city and county, and in places that have them, township boundaries, to make sure that those are accurate. The VTD program, VTD is for Voting Tabulation District, and that allows states to submit the boundaries of their electoral precincts, so that those will be held as tabulation block boundaries, and that means that you can get exact population counts for each of your electoral districts, and that can can be a real help in redistricting because it sort of marries up census geography and election geography. The Boundary and Annexation Survey, or BAS, is the normal process for updating and correcting city limit boundaries mostly, townships too, I believe. And the SDRP tracks school district boundaries. So those all happen prior to Census Day, right up until early 2020. Because, for instance, well, the actual cutoff date for geographic updates is January 1st, 2020. And so they have to get any changes that have been made up till that point. As I said, April 1st, 2020 is the official Census Day. January 1st, 2021 is the deadline for the apportionment results to be released to the states. So, as I recall, it's, let me do my math here. I think January 3rd is the normal start of Congress. The president, as the head of the executive branch, has a week to get the, to get the census counts to the House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives has 15 days, if that works out right, to release the results of the redistribution of the seats in Congress to the states. April 1st, 2021 is the deadline for the Census Bureau to actually get those fine, low-level redistricting population counts out to the states for use in redistricting. Deadlines for completing redistricting vary by state. It partly depends who's doing it, whether it's the legislature or a commission. Washington just moved its deadline to November 15th, 2021. It had been January 1st of the year, ending in 2. So that can change also, so be aware of that. And then November 8th, 2022 are the first federal elections, specifically to Congress, using the newly adopted district lines. And I'll turn it over to Michelle for the next little bit.
Thank you, Nick. My name is Michelle Davis, and I'm in Maryland. I work for the Maryland Legislature. And I want to start today with just a high-level overview of who exactly is responsible for redistricting. And it's kind of an assumption that state legislatures draw their own boundaries. And they also draw congressional lines, but the question is, where do they get the legal authority to do that? So if you ever had to answer that question, here is the answer. For congressional districts, there's no specific place in the Constitution that actually says states shall draw congressional districts, so that's the first thing to know. And what you should know is that it just comes from the election clause in the Constitution, which you can see on this slide, which basically gives states the power to manage federal elections in the state. So just like all of the other duties that they have in regards to running a federal election, redistricting is considered part of that process. Now, I've highlighted the language in the clause that says Congress at any time may sort of take back that power and make or alter regulations. So it is possible for Congress to decide that they want to take that process out of, or at least to some degree, out of the state's hands. But historically, they have not. So that's congressional districts. And state legislative districts, it's sort of a reserved power. I mean, states have the state legislatures have the sovereign power to sort of take care of their own body, and so redistricting and redrawing their own boundaries is considered part of that. So again, no specific clause, but definitely in the Constitution for both of those. Next, I want to talk about the fact that states or state legislatures are sort of this default entity that does redistricting, like we just talked about, but a lot of states have decided to delegate that duty in some form or fashion into to a commission. I will say this, commissions, when people say redistricting commissions, they could mean many different things. And as you can see on this slide, there are many different kinds of commissions. We won't go into detail on each one, but I know the NCSL has a page devoted to this, and they sort of explain the differences between all of these. But in general, you can have sort of the basic commission early on, like in the 80s and the 90s, were partisan commissions, where basically the task of redistricting was sort of given to a handful of legislators in the legislature, and they would maybe make them even or not even, depending on the makeup of the entire legislature. And that way it would be bipartisan. There are also commissions that only come in when when the legislature can't agree. They're considered advisory commissions. There are also nonpartisan commissions. Lately, and when I say lately, I mean this past decade, independent commissions have been coming up on, I should say, in several states, they've passed initiatives to create independent commissions, and I have some links here on this slide that will take you to that. Independent commissions are generally what I will say generally in conversations what people mean when they say redistricting commissions. They're really referring to these commissions that sort of are separate from the legislature, and there are no legislative members on the commission. And one of the reasons why they're considered independent is because of the way they choose the people. They're usually not affiliated with lobbyists or legislatures or anything like that. The only other thing I want to note about this subject is you may hear, if you are going to be involved in redistricting, you may have already heard or you will hear Iowa as an example of a completely nonpartisan sort of way for a state to redistrict. I want to make 2 points about that. One is Iowa, demographically compared to a lot of other states, is not as heterogeneous, so it's much easier to redistrict in Iowa. That's one thing. But also, people always leave out part of their process. The first part of their process is nonpartisan staff, which would probably include a lot of people listening to this, actually draw the maps. The second part you usually don't hear is that those maps either get a up or down vote from the legislature. So it's possible for the legislature to not accept the map. And the details on that process I know are on the NCSL website as well. But they can sort of go back and forth 2 or 3 times, I think. And if they don't accept any of those maps from the nonpartisan staff, then the legislature can make a map of their own. So the default is sort of the legislature draws the maps. I don't think they've ever done that, but I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on Iowa. But I will say a lot of times when you hear Iowa, you only hear the first part, that nonpartisan staff draws the maps. But they have a whole process for that. The next thing I want to talk about is local legislative redistricting. Much of what you hear about redistricting has to do with congressional districts and state legislative districts. Almost all of what you hear in the media is about those 2 types of districts. The vast majority of redistricting boundary adjustments actually occur at the local level. If you can imagine, there are tons more local jurisdictions than there are states. So we're talking about tens of thousands of local entities that have to redistrict just like states do at least every 10 years. Just to give you some examples of entities that you might not have thought would have to redraw boundaries, I have a list here. The common ones are what you might think: townships, county councils, school boards, but you might not have realized that certain utility districts have to redistrict, the California Board of Equalization, which is a taxing authority in California, has to do that. Basically, any local government entity that has elected members and districts has to redistrict. So keep that in mind. And when I say keep that in mind, a few years ago, I came across a study in Indiana where actually a woman professor realized that in the entire state of Indiana, almost all of the local jurisdictions, even the counties, were not redistricting because they either didn't know they had to, or maybe they didn't have the capacity or the will to do it. And she sort of headed an effort to get Indiana to do this. Now, granted, each one of those local jurisdictions, you could have went in court and sued them on an equal population challenge, but this woman sort of ran an organized effort, and I have the link here to that page where you can sort of see a whole listing of all these counties in Indiana that were either non-compliant a few years ago, maybe they are now, and some that may still be. I put that up there as a point that wherever you're listening from, whatever state you're in, more than likely there is some entity. It may not be a large entity like a county or anything like that, but you may have some smaller municipality that might have trouble with that and might not be doing it, and you would never know unless you checked. So I'd like to always point that out to people, that there are so many other entities that have to do this. Whether they do or not, we don't know. And your takeaway for this section is here. First thing to know is that if you are thinking or if you are involved in any kind of project that that is sort of pondering an independent commission, then the first place you want to sort of look for direction is Arizona and California. California in particular, they have been sort of a model for this sort of thing. Now, every commission in every state is different. There are no two schemes that are exactly alike. But as we know, as staff, we always look to other states to sort of guide us if they have done something that we're looking to do. And so if you're looking, or if you need to look into an independent commission, California is sort of looked at as a model. So I would start there. I wouldn't end there, but I would certainly start there. In this past year, the midterm elections, I believe 3 states have passed ballot initiatives to approve independent commissions. So you would want to look at that as well. I think Ohio is in the process. So keep in mind that every commission is different. And the other thing that you need to know is we've talked about legislatures, which is sort of the default authority for drawing lines, and then they may give that to a commission, assign that to a commission, but also courts in this country, many courts in this country draw maps as well, and it's for many different reasons. Maybe a map went to court and it did not make it, it was invalidated, and the court decided to draw a map on its own instead of sending it back to the legislature. That happens sometimes, as in Nevada. The legislature just simply cannot agree, and it goes to a court, and they draw the map. There are many reasons. I did a sort of a non-scientific sort of analysis here. How many states so far currently have court-drawn maps. Now, in Maryland, we had one during the 2000 cycle, and then the rest of these states that you see listed here are current in this cycle. These are states that are operating on maps that were drawn by courts. So don't leave out or don't forget that courts draw maps as well. And Nick, I'll send it over to you.
Sure, thank you. And I'll just follow on with that and say that that actually happened in Washington in the 70s. In 1972-73, the courts imposed a deadline on Washington to redistrict. They couldn't meet it. The districts were ultimately drawn by a special master, and that was a large part of the impetus for actually implementing our redistricting commission, which dates to 1983. And I'll just actually throw in a plug for the model used in Washington. It's like Arizona's. It's 5 people, but in Arizona, the chair, who's supposed to be nonpartisan, is the swing vote in adopting a map, and that has led in the past sometimes to charges that swing vote was not actually nonpartisan, was favoring one side or the other. In Washington, we have 4 members who are appointed by the legislative leadership, and they appoint a chair, but the chair actually does not vote. And to adopt a map, you actually have to get 3 of the 4 legislatively appointed members to agree. So I'll just put in a little plug for that model. And moving on, I just wanted to familiarize you with some census geography terms that you should know if you're going to be working with census data, as you will have to if you're working on redistricting. So the census has a number of geographic areas that are nested within each other. This is sort of the basic hierarchy of how things work. At the top is obviously the top is the United States as a whole, but the next level is the states or state equivalents like Virgin Islands or the District of Columbia. The next is the county or equivalent. So 48 states have counties. 2, you have Louisiana with parishes, and you have boroughs in Alaska. And the funny thing about Alaska is the boroughs they're kind of a hybrid of a county and a state government. They're somewhere, a county and a city government. And like a city, they only exist where the locals have actively created them. So there are large parts of Alaska that are not part of any borough. And so that those areas are divided up by the Census Bureau in consultation with the state into census areas, specifically for census counts. Below the county or equivalent, you have census tracts, and I'll show you an illustration of what those look like in a little bit. So some very small counties might be a single census tract. Some large counties will have hundreds. You have below that the census block group. And tracts and block groups are commonly used for demographic analyses. So you'll see a lot of studies of income or education or whatever at the census tract level, since it's sort of the size of a smallish town. It's intended to be about a few thousand people, so that within a city, you can see different neighborhoods. It's a convenient sort of size, and it's relatively permanent from census to census. Again, below that, the block group, and below that, the census block. The census block is the smallest area for which population figures are published. Now, the Census Bureau and their internal workings actually has a point on a map for each housing unit in the country, but they don't release those, at least for a long time after the census. They don't release information down to the address level. They release it at the census block level. And a census block is created by taking all of the legal boundaries that the Census Bureau holds, and some statistical boundaries, and then visible features like roads and streams and things like that, and then just sort of overlaying that over the map and breaking everything up into these census blocks. We'll get into a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So some of those legal and statistical boundaries they use are congressional districts, state legislative districts, what are called minor civil divisions, or MCDs, and that's a cover term for the towns in New England, which have their own governments and are relatively large, not compact like a city would be. Townships in states like Michigan, where I lived for a while, that have their own governments. In states that don't have any kind of exhaustive geography below the county level, the Census Bureau draws county subdivisions, so you might see that. And then places, and places include incorporated cities and towns. And then the census also tracks unincorporated communities, which are then known as census designated places, or CDPs. So again, the boundaries, any boundary of any of these types of geography is going to be held as a block boundary, in addition to those visible features. And here I apologize that the map is not quite as at high resolution, so I hope it's not too fuzzy. But here you can see all the tracts in Thurston County, which is my home county in Washington. That's about 250,000 people, all in all. So you can see that each tract is designated with a number. Sometimes that number includes a trailing decimal, and that reflects historically how the tracts have been broken up over time as they got too big to be an ideal tract. And then here you can just really see the lines. Those are the block groups within the tracts. And then within those, each of these little colored polygons is a census block. And zooming in here, show you the kind of bright red line that runs from north to south is the legislative district boundary. Washington uses the same districts for our House and Senate, so we just call them legislative districts. The kind of pinky purple line running from west to east is a school district boundary. The kind of gray stippled areas are cities, City of Tumwater in the south, City of Olympia in the north. So you can sort of see how all of those different lines, along with the visible features like roads, railroads, there are actually also blocks under the water areas too. But just for clarity, I didn't show you those. How all of those geographies sort of conspire to create a set of census blocks. And there are other geographies tracked by the census, not just the political ones. You get school districts, elementary and secondary and unified. In Washington, they're all unified. They're all the same classification. American Indian and Alaska Native areas and Hawaiian homelands. And if your state participated in the VTT program, also those voting tabulation districts, which is census speak for electoral precincts. So what you actually get from the Census Bureau by April 1st of the year ending in 1 is called the PL 94-171 redistricting data. And what this is counts of population, not population. That actually is a word, it's from biochemistry. But what we're actually getting is population broken out by race and ethnicity. Important to note, Hispanic or Latino or Latina is considered an ethnicity by the Census Bureau. People of any race can be Hispanic or Latino. And so the way that's actually done is sort of complicated. They give you a table of all the census blocks, the population of each race in that census block. They give you a second table that in the first column breaks out the people who are Hispanic or Latino, and the other columns are all the racial categories, listing the people or enumerating the people who did not consider themselves Hispanic or Latino. And then, and as you can see in the third bullet, you get those same two tables for only the population 18 years of age or older. And this goes down to the census block level, which is important if you're trying to divide things up very, very finely. Historically, the courts have held congressional district to a very strict standard of equality, and in Washington, we tend to cut up our legislative districts in a very equal way as well. There may be other sources of information that are useful to you. Election data, where that's allowed. There are states and situations where it is not allowed to look at past election data to try to predict how the new districts will behave. There are demographic data from other sources from your own state. So for instance, our budget office, the Office of Financial Management, tracks demographic data. The Census Bureau itself conducts the American Community Survey, or ACS, which tracks much richer data than the census itself, again, in terms of like income and education and all sorts of things like that, household size and type. That's done for various geographies, cities above a certain size, census tracts, and so on, counties. And also public input. In Washington, in the 2011 cycle, we took the Commission on the Road for a series of public forums. I believe there were 17 all around the world, or all around the state. We got input from the public about, it really doesn't make any sense to have us in with that other city. We should be over here. So you should be aware of any such requirements for your state. Be also aware of any Open Public Records or Open Public Meetings Act type requirements and be aware of public expectations. Redistricting is a high-profile subject right now, so people will be wanting probably to weigh in, and with the rise of the internet and it being relatively easy to shuttle large amounts of data around from place to place and create maps. Michelle will show you applications later. You can even create maps online, have people submit input that way. So be aware of that expectation that people have to be engaged with the process. So what makes a good redistricting plan? It's commonly applied criteria that many states recognize. The districts must be equal in population to the other districts of the same type within the same chamber of the legislature or other congressional districts. They have to be contiguous. They should not be composed of disconnected pieces or have holes in them. They should be compact, regularly shaped, easy to travel around in without having to go outside the district, because you've got all sorts of fingers of territory from different districts sort of interleaving. The idea, and this isn't something you'll see in the law or legal scholars, but the way I think of it is, this goes back to, this idea of district representation goes back to like medieval England with their parliament, and each county would elect, or certain other areas like towns would elect a representative to go to parliament, and it was a community that was electing one of their own. Or early on, it was not many people electing them, but they were designating somebody to represent their interests in parliament. So the sort of basic idea is that each district is a community that shares a greater affinity with the other members of that community than with people outside. So that's sort of the basic rationale behind these criteria. They should respect natural barriers to transportation and communication. If you've got a mountain range or a huge wide river, they should respect the boundaries of local jurisdictions that have been established using other procedures, and communities of interest. So if you have a section of a city where people tend to interact with each other and have certain commonality of interest, it may, and the courts have been, they've differed over time when it's good to split up a community like that and diffuse its power, or whether it should be kept whole. So that's, again, there's a lot of case law to look at. Generally, districts should not favor or disfavor any political, racial, or ethnic group, and should encourage electoral competition. In some jurisdictions, they explicitly try to preserve the cores of existing districts. The rationale there, or the rationalization, depending on your point of view, that constituents should not be separated from the people who've been representing them. They've established those relationships. The incumbents should not have to run against each other in a single district. Obviously, if you lose a congressional district, somebody's going to have to, or retire. And a recently applied criterion in some court cases is the idea that the electoral behavior of the districts as a group, your legislative or your congressional district, should reflect how the state votes in statewide contests, so for governor or U.S. Senate. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle again to continue talking about those cases.
Thank you, Nick. Before we get into a little bit of the law of redistricting, I wanted to start with gerrymandering. Before we get deep into that, I want to point out two things. One is, we all say gerrymandering, but the actual pronunciation is gerrymandering. So you might hear that every now and then, although most people say gerry. I won't go into why that is so, because that'll take up more time. Second thing is, I want you, while I'm talking, if you can, take a look at this slide that I have up now. You'll see 5 maps of North Carolina, and at the outset, let me just say that what you are looking at are, except for one, these are all conceptual maps. drawn by a computer algorithm. So a person did not draw the maps, most of the maps on this slide, and it. I'm not picking on North Carolina. If there are any North Carolina folks on this call, this is just meant as a visual exercise, and if you take a look at all 5 of the maps, and everyone believes, or most people believe, that they can spot a map that is gerrymandered. And the corollary to that is you can spot a map that isn't, or that seems to be drawn pretty fairly. So take a look at the slide now, and I'm going to say at the outset that there are 2 so-called fair maps, and when I say so-called, I mean maps that produce a competitive competitive House delegation in this case, because these are congressional districts. So there 2 of these maps are actually considered competitive. If we don't use the term fair, let's just say competitive. And when we think about gerrymandering, probably the number one thing is the shape of the districts, and the more sort of squiggly they are, the more it might suggest a gerrymander. And so that's why compactness is considered a good objective way to sort of sniff out whether there's a gerrymander or not. So this is to prove that is not always the case. So if you've been looking at this slide for a minute, let's go to the next slide. And here you'll see that there are 2 maps that yield a pretty even result for elections for the House in North Carolina, and then there are 3 that are slanted one way or the other. But if you'll notice, I would bet that most people looking at this would at least find the map on the bottom and to the right as to be a very compact map, and definitely not a gerrymander. But in a sense, it is. It doesn't yield it as even of a result as the other 2. Now, your definition of fair might be different, because I don't know what the partisan makeup is of the North Carolina House delegation. But so this was just meant as a sort of an exercise in looking at boundaries and determining whether something is a gerrymander. The point you should take from this is that you really cannot look at a map unless you know the state very well that you're looking at. But other than that, you can't just look at a map and judge whether something is a gerrymander or not based on, say, how compact it looks and if it's pretty or not. So there are very ugly gerrymanders, and there's some very well maintained, very compact gerrymanders as well. So let's go on to the law of redistricting. This is again very high level overview, but it's meant to be practical in the sense of if you are in a position where you haven't been thinking about this subject for the last 20 years, like probably we have, but you need to get up to date on it because it's your area now. This right here is sort of your reading guide. There are so many cases about redistricting in general and in these different areas. The case law is prolific, even at the Supreme Court level. So getting a handle on that can be very daunting. So here's sort of a cheat sheet. If you need to sort of become well versed in it, but you don't have hundreds of hours to read hundreds of cases, you probably get a good start, I think, if you started here. What I've done is I've divided on the left the different sort of sources of law. There's a lot of law in the Voting Rights Act and in state constitutions and in the 14th Amendment. And then when you look into each one, I break it down to the common causes of action, as they say in legalese. But that's what you would be suing for if you went to court. What you'd be litigating on. So if you're taking a map to court, it would be on one of these bases. The most common one is equal population, obviously, and that's the typical state or local jurisdiction who has failed to redistrict. That's simply one claim, or maybe they have redistricted, but not very well, at least in someone's eyes, and the districts are not equally populated. So that's sort of the basic foundational sort of claim in redistricting. And actually, this happens more often than you might think. A lot of states try, but they can't agree, and so a case will go to court under this equal population. So what I've done is divided up top. I've separated the foundational cases. These are cases that happened a long time ago, but they still ring true today, and every court case or every Supreme Court case is going to quote these and sort of start their reasoning at these foundational cases. So if you need to know about redistricting and you need to know about the law of redistricting, excuse me, you would probably want to start with these. You would have to know these cases fairly good, or at least understand the rule of law that came from them. So that's sort of your foundational reading. And then you have cases that are fairly recent, or some that are ongoing in this cycle, and cycle being this 10-year cycle that we're in right now for redistricting. Voting Rights Act cases as well. Very important. The most interesting thing that has happened this cycle in 2013 is the Shelby County case, which basically made an entire section of the Voting Rights Act not applicable anymore to a lot of states and other jurisdictions. It's actually the coverage formula in Section 4. There's a lot written on that. You should probably know about it. And then actually on a state level, to me, I think this is an important case because this could pop up in other states. This League of Women Voters case basically is the first partisan gerrymander case based on a state constitution. The kicker is that the clause that they based the decision on it, the court based the decision on, is in a lot of other state constitutions. So definitely something you want to have in the back of your mind, because some people are predicting that other litigants in other states are going to try to do this in coming cycles. But going back up, if you notice, there are a couple more cases that are in green. If you look, there's a Maryland case, Benesek, and then there's a North Carolina case, the Rucho case. I think I'm saying that right. Those are the two cases that were argued at the Supreme Court today. Oral arguments were today, so that we're right in the middle of some important partisan gerrymandering. Perhaps new law, we'll see, but at any rate, it'll be important. I also highlighted in green the Tennant case, as you can see, under equal population. I think that's important because there hasn't been a lot going on in that area up until this case, which basically sort of made an exception, if you will, to the equal population rule for congressional districts. In practice, congressional districts need to be like one or two people apart. In other words, almost as equal as possible. So if you have an odd number of people in the state, then it can deviate by one or two. But for the most part, the Supreme Court demands strict equality. But it does allow for certain exceptions, and this was sort of an exception. Maybe exception isn't the best word, but the deviation was I believe at least several hundred people. It was 0.79%, which is a significant number considering most states get it down to, 1, 2, or 3 people. So I would keep this. If you need to review the law, I would keep that slide in your back pocket. So let me quickly go. I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to have to go a little bit faster. This is just a list. If you have to organize yourself and really understand what happened in your state in particular, these are all the sort of sources, places you can go in your state that maybe you can find information about redistricting, what you've done in maybe the past 2 decades. Sometimes there are attorney general opinions that are floating around. Also, whatever the commission or the committee in your legislature who deals with the maps, they may have information, and you have to review all the litigation in your state, at least for the past 10 years. That's just an absolute necessity. And, of course, review your state laws and so on. And you also have to pay attention, again, to what's going on with partisan gerrymandering in the Supreme Court right now. So this year, sometime this summer, maybe late this summer, there will be a decision on those 2 cases that were in oral argument today, and they will affect you no matter which way they decide. That will inform what you do in the next cycle. So let me quickly go with sort of the data and technology. Nick went over a lot of this, so I won't really spend any time on it. I think he explained really good how data is sort of compiled in layers, but I just wanted to give you sort of a screenshot of what it would actually look like if you were actually trying to draw a map, and this is what it looks like. And the key to it is you have the data layers on the bottom, the layers piled on top of each other, and then you have the actual data that's connected to the layers, and that's up top. If you can imagine that there's a spreadsheet attached to every geographical data layer, and that gives you the information that you need in order to move boundaries around. And it can be a lot of data. If you're looking for what kind of software you should use if you have to do this for your state, I will say the most popular, at least for state legislatures, what I would guess would be Maptitude and ArcGIS. ArcGIS has been around not as a redistricting software, but just for any kind of GIS. They are sort of the industry standard, and I'm not a cartographer or anything like that, but I don't know of any other major program that cartographers or geographers use. Maybe it's out there, but at least in the world of redistricting, ArcGIS has been around, and it can be used for redistricting. It wasn't developed specifically for redistricting. Autobound was, but it's what's called a what do they call it? It's meant to work inside of ArcGIS, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm not a technical person, so Nick, if you want to follow up on that, you can.
Yeah, it's an extension to ArcGIS.
That's what it is.
Inside.
An extension, yes. So Maptitude, I believe, is the first software that was made. It's not an extension to anything. It is its own thing, and they're sort of like competitors of ArcGIS because they have another sort of mapping software that's just mapping software, and then they have Maptitude, which is designed specifically for redistricting, and that's the one I'm more knowledgeable about, and I work in it. I can move around in ArcGIS, but I'm really just a visitor there. But those are sort of the 3 big ones, and there are other players out there, but these are the main ones. If you're looking for open source, and what that is sort of free software on the internet that you can use to do this. A lot of people use this software to submit their own plans to commissions or legislatures and so on. These are the 2, and these are all have links, by the way, that I'm describing to you. So let me get to the end here. I know we're running out of time. This, I believe, is probably the most important thing I'm going to say. If you are a person that has to do this and you're new to redistricting and you're trying to absorb everything you can, and it is a lot, I really think that one of the most important things, I would say, maybe second to reviewing all the law cases I discussed, is actually getting online and playing this game. And I know what you're thinking, it's a game, but it's actually a way, short of buying Maptitude and pretending to draw a map. I mean, that's a pretty steep learning curve. But this game, I've played it before, and it allows you to sort of understand what a person who actually has to operate GIS software and make maps and sort of make decisions with the data and so on. This allows you to be in that person's shoes, but you don't have to learn so much, in order to, if you don't know how to use Maptitude or ArcGIS. So it puts you in a position to where you have to prioritize all of the things that someone who is really drawing a map would have to do. And there are so many competing priorities, and it's all a balancing test. So you have to use the information that you're getting on the fly every time you make a particular move in the software. It tells you what you've done and how it affects all of those priorities. One being compactness, or the elected official that represents that, the incumbent basically that represents that area, what it does to them, what it does to the underlying communities. And then you also have to comply with the various statutes that are listed in that other slide. So if you can imagine, it's just kind of schizophrenic. You have to keep track of a lot of things. And this game will force you to do that without you having to learn complicated GIS software. So if you're going to be involved in redistricting, I recommend that. So I'll leave you now to the administrators here to close out the session.
Wow, that was amazing, Nick and Michelle. I so appreciate it. I wish that you could just hear everyone at their little desks applauding for you, because you covered the whole waterfront. That was amazing. There are two things that I want to do before we close up shop, and one is to mention that we'll have a webinar, sort of a similar model to this, on census outreach, what states can do. That's Friday, May 17th. So please join us for that. We will be talking about outreach, complete count committees, and the economic impact the census has. Then also, we mentioned at the top, and I want to mention it again, that we have in-person 2.5-day seminars called Getting Ready to Redistrict. So everything that you experienced today as just a quick bite, and it went by really fast, we'll do each chunk of that in more detail at 5 seminars coming up in the next 2.5 years. And the first is in Providence, June 20th to the 23rd. We want you to come. And if you can't make that one, there's 4 more coming along after that. It is 1 o'clock on the dot. We don't have real questions in the chat box. I will say that the interest in there was largely on the GIS data management side of things, and the one idea in there was to do a webinar on that. So we will be thinking about that option. So I'm going to call it quits here, but I do want you to ask you all to stay on, because there'll be a 1-minute survey for you to do, and in that you can give us ideas for other things that you would like to have come after this. So thanks to our presenters, and thanks to you all for participating, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.